recently, not real recently, but it's been a while back, on a quiz show. The question was asked about what people remembered about the spirit of St. Louis. And I was really shocked that it must have been a bunch of kids that were contestants or something like that. People weren't familiar with the spirit of St. Louis or Charles Lindbergh. But some of us my age and a little older, Charles Lindbergh was a big deal. I mean, wasn't he? You know, he was like a rock star of his day, this hero that flew across the Atlantic Ocean solo. It was remarkable stuff. It's been over 36 years ago, probably 38 years ago. I had to make a trip when I worked for the government to Washington, D.C. with a guy that was a major, and we were doing some work for procuring some military equipment, and HL, who was the major that I was with, wanted to go to the Smithsonian on an afternoon that we had off, and he said, we won't see much, but we'll get to see the Air and Space Museum. And you know, I've always been interested in aviation stuff, so we went there, and the two highlights for me were the Mercury capsule that Alan Shepard flew in, the first American in space, and then the Spirit of St. Louis. How many of you have ever seen that live, the Spirit of St. Louis? I see one nod, two nods, only two of you. I was struck with how tiny this plane is. It's dinky. I mean, it looks to me like it's smaller than a Piper Cub or something. It's so tiny. And most of us are aware of Lindbergh, but how many of you know the names of Lindbergh's two stoutest competitors in that transatlantic flight? Anybody? You know, sometimes we learn more from the things that we weren't aware of than from talking about our heroes. Well, the first serious contender with Lindbergh, well, first let me ask, how many of you know why Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic? Was it bragging rights, you think? No. There was a hotel owner, a rich guy named Ortiz, that offered a prize, and this is a picture of Raymond Ortiz. He offered a prize, this was back in the 1920s, of $25,000 to the first person who could fly across the Atlantic Ocean. There wasn't even a stipulation that it had to be solo. It was the first people that could make it across. And now $25,000 doesn't sound like a huge incentive to us, but in the 1920s, that was about $250,000 in our money today. So we're talking about some sizable cash that Ortiz offered in that prize to whoever could make it from New York to Paris. The first competitor that Lindbergh had was a guy by the name of René Fonck. He was a French World War I flying ace. Now, I'm not a judge of handsomeness, but you ladies think that was a handsome guy? Okay, I see a couple of nods. He was dashing. He was a World War I hero and a flying ace. And he got a crew of 3 people together, and they were going to fly from New York to Paris. Well, I don't mean to denigrate anybody here who is of French descent, but Fonck was I mean, talk about somebody that was a rock star. He was one of the stars of his day, and he wanted to arrive in Paris in style, right? He was used to the good life, and so in this airplane that he got hold of to make this transatlantic flight, they had heavy chairs. They had mahogany tables. You know, mahogany's not light. They had not just bottles, but cases of wine and champagne. They wanted to arrive happy, I guess, when they got to Paris. There was a cooking area in that plane with a little kitchen. There was a sofa that could be converted into a bed. And before takeoff from New York, Funk ordered a dinner, a hot dinner, from a hotel there in New York, and it included clam chowder, terrapin, that's turtle for any of you who don't do terrapins, roast duck and turkey kept warm in a heavily insulated cabinet. So you can tell this guy was used to the good life, right? All of this stuff and luxury was so heavy they had to put a special, I don't have my pointer, but they had to have a special rear wheel put on the plane that was stout enough to carry all of this. This plane was designed to carry 20,000 pounds. A lot of weight. Well, it's a big, I think it was a 3-engine monster. Well, the problem was all of the stuff that Funk wanted to take along weighed 28,000 pounds, right? You, any of you ever tried to ride on a plane that was overloaded? Well, yeah, Kenny's nodding his head there, yeah, okay. Well, Funk's plane, with his 3 people in the crew, made it all the way to the end of the runway. And it tipped over nose first, and here is an actual picture of the result. It burst into flame. Funk and one of his crew members made it out alive. The other 2 were killed. So you can see that Funk never made it across the Atlantic in that airplane. The other of the competitors was a guy by the name of Charles Levine. Now, Levine wasn't going to fly a plane himself. There he is on the right. He had a lot of money, another rich guy, and so he figured he was going to hire 2 different crews to fly this excellent plane across the Atlantic Ocean. The pilots of the 2 crews were a guy named Chamberlain and a guy named Bertrand. And this is Bertrand standing with Mr. Levine on the right there. And the problem was Chamberlain and Bertrand couldn't agree on anything. They couldn't agree on the flight plan. They couldn't agree on the equipment. And so they battled one another constantly. And the night before, Levine said he was going to pick which crew was going to fly across the Atlantic. He came to both pilots with a contract asking them to sign it. And the contract said that if there was any money that was made from publicity about this flight, Levine was going to get it all. The pilots would get nothing. I don't know if they were scheduled to get any of that $25,000 prize or just a part of it. I don't know what that arrangement was, but any subsequent money that came from appearances or endorsements or anything like that, the pilots would get zero. Well, Bertrand must have known a judge or somebody, because he went and got hold of a judge, got an injunction, a temporary injunction on the flight, and the flight was grounded until the differences could be resolved in the contracting of that thing. And so they never took off, because they could never come to an agreement on this. Okay, Charles Lindbergh. Now, Lindbergh oversaw every step of this plane being built. He was in the factory. He was there supervising. I remember looking on the Spirit of St. Louis. At that time, you walked kind of on like it was like a second story, and you could look down on the Spirit of St. Louis. And I remember saying, well, look at that. They took the windshield out and put fabric over that. In reading about this, I found out there never was a front windshield. Lindbergh had the glass taken out to save weight and put fabric there. And the only way he could see to navigate were either looking at the side window or looking through a little periscope that was installed in the front of the plane. That was the way that he flew. The plane that he ordered to be built just had one engine to save weight. That way they could carry more fuel. It had one seat for one pilot, and it was a pretty Spartan seat at that. No onboard refrigerators or stoves or anything like that. I remember seeing a movie about that flight. Jimmy Stewart played the part of Charles Lindbergh, and he was like drinking out of a thermos and eating sandwiches along the way. I remember the one critical place along the flight was the wings on the plane started collecting ice. And it was getting heavier and heavier. It got down so low he couldn't get any altitude, and the wheels of the plane were hitting the tops of the waves on the Atlantic. But the good thing was it got down where it was warm enough, the ice started melting and coming off of the wings. So he was able to survive that thing. I think it must have been a pretty close thing for him, though. During that flight, but Lindbergh supervised everything. He even took his navigational charts and trimmed the excess paper off of the edges to save weight. He really cut back on everything. It was very Spartan, because he wanted to save every ounce he could to make it successfully to Paris. Well, Lindbergh landed in Paris on May the 21st, 1927, 33 and a half hours after he left New York. It's a little bit longer than a flight takes today. There were all sorts of cheering people, thousands, as you can see on this picture, that greeted him as he came flying into Paris. The press dubbed him, what was his nickname? Who remembers?
Lucky Lindy.
Lucky Lindy. Yes, they called him Lucky Lindy. But do you think him making it to Paris was all luck? No, it wasn't all luck. He did a lot of careful planning. He made a lot of sacrifices. He did a lot of smart things to be able to make it from New York to Paris. Well, what I want you to hear in this story about Lindbergh and the Orteig Prize is just like that flight didn't happen by luck or by accident. It wasn't that he was out on a flight one day and got lost and, oh, wait a minute, here I am. I've flown from New York to Paris by accident. No, that wasn't the way that it happened. It took careful planning, it took disciplined action, and generosity works the same way. It doesn't happen by accident. Giving doesn't happen just because you're lucky. It takes careful thought and planning and disciplined action. Now the problem that Tom Berlin says we have in America is that a lot of us are like funk, right? We're loaded down with so much stuff that instead of soaring away from financial gravity, we get pulled down by all of the junk that we think is so important to our lives, to our comfort, that we never really get off the ground with what we have as our goal. Other couples and families are like Levine and his associates. They have competing goals, they can't agree on stuff, and they end up bickering and quibbling, and so they never meet their goals because they're pulling in different directions. If we want our lives to be generous ones, we have got to be as careful and as disciplined as Lindbergh. Like I said, generosity happens by design. It's not an accident. It's not luck. Generous people know that if you're going to give a significant amount of money or give a significant amount of time, it takes discipline and sacrifice and planning. You can't, if you're on a church committee that meets at 7, at 6:55, you can't say, well, I wonder what I should make for supper. Right? It doesn't work that way. So we've got to sacrifice things and plan if we're going to make a contribution of our time or our money. It takes strategy, and then it takes the courage to act. Tom Berlin wrote that he talked to a lot of financially generous people over the years, because his ministry is all about being able to be financially generous. And he said that financially generous people have basically what amounts to 3 secrets. 3 things that they do, 3 things that they make priorities in order to be able to be generous. Here are those 3 secrets. Number 1, make a budget. Now last week I handed out these budget sheets. Is there anybody here that didn't get one, that wants a budget sheet? You've got your choice of this complicated one. Darcy, okay. And the other one is a simple one from Dave Ramsey's organization. Okay. Here, I'll tell you what. Can you two cooperate and not fight in your goals? There's that one, and I'll give you one of these other ones that Berlin put together. But like I said, I think this is a little complicated. Oops. Anybody? Jay? Okay. So budgeting is important. And like I said, I'm kind of simple-minded. So I looked at this and I said, this is too hard. So I went with Dave Ramsey's. And I found that one a whole lot easier to use. Anybody else need one? Need one of these? Okay, Joe? Here we go. My fingers used to grip things when I was younger, Joe, but now they just kind of slides. Yeah, okay. Well, at any rate, so budgeting is the first secret of really generous people. And Berlin said, if faith and giving to support that faith are going to be a priority in our lives, we have to start looking at how God wants us to allocate all of our money, all of our resources in every area of our lives. It's got to be a whole deal. It's got to cover all of the bases. And if we don't plan how we're going to allocate all of our resources in every area of our life, what's going to happen is we pay the bills first, and you folks know as well as I do what happens. If we just say, well, we'll give God the leftovers at the end, you pay the bills, see some things that you'd like or you want, and you get to the end and there aren't any leftovers, right? Because everything's gone already unless you plan for it first. Often there are no leftovers. So using a budget helps us to look at what kind of spending in all of these areas in our lives are pleasing to God, and it's a way of acknowledging that money really is given to us by God to take care of every area in our lives, and all of our lives need to be governed by God's priorities. The second secret of generous people is to live simply. Now, this isn't just generous people. I think that you find that wealthy people, a lot of them live pretty simply. You know, I've heard that Warren Buffett lives in the same house that he lived in for, 40 or 50 years or more. I mean, and it's not a mansion, no gold fixtures in the bathrooms, no indoor heated swimming pools or things like that. And the guy could afford it, but that's not the way he lives. He lives simply. He doesn't drive a Ferrari every place. He has a good, reliable car, not the most expensive one. He doesn't buy his clothes at designer places. He doesn't fly over to Paris to have the top designers clothe him. It's like Berlin said, generous people, and from this book, Thomas Stanley and William Danko, they wrote a book called The Millionaire Next Door, and observed that wealthy people often live in average homes, drive used cars, and don't wear the most expensive clothes. They understand the difference between needs and wants. They gain their wealth a lot of times by careful attention to how money is used and spent in their business, and they bring that home and budget the money at home just as they do in business. They have been frugal in business, and that pushes them toward living a simple personal life. And Berlin said that simplicity is the single most effective tool to be used by people who want to escape financial gravity. It's like that song, Things We Leave Behind. Simplicity really is key. Now, people who are pulled down by financial gravity usually think of simplicity as the absence of stuff or as an uncomfortable way of living. They assume that simple means that you sleep on a hard bed, the car is undependable, the clothes are unfashionable, uncomfortable, and you live on hardtack and gruel every day. But that's not the way that it is, because all of our consumption really is a burden. as in that song again. Freedom and joy in life doesn't come from the things that we own as much as sometimes from the things that we leave behind for God's sake and for the good of others. Gravity defiers understand that simplicity is not about simply denying yourself, but avoiding doing the things that weigh you down and putting our resources toward our main goals, toward what is most important. The third secret of generous people is setting goals for generosity. Generous people set goals about what they hope to do with their time and money, because it's like I'm trying to think. Zig Ziglar was the guy that said, if you plan for nothing or you aim at nothing, you're going to hit it every time, right? So setting goals is really, really important. I think I've shared with you folks about when our younger son and his fiance said they were going to be married in Hawaii. And, we've never been wealthy, and so we kind of swallowed hard, and it's like, okay, how are we going to afford to go to Hawaii so we can see our son and future daughter-in-law married? And so we had just taken Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University, and we followed those steps that Dave Ramsey said about you have the envelopes, you use cash only, and you allocate money for different things, and you allocate some for giving and some for savings, for meeting that goal. Our goal was to get to Hawaii without having to swim back. And so we made it all the way there, all the way back after the wedding, which was great. And we even managed to eat while we were there in the process. But it was a close thing though, right? We went grocery shopping the first day we were there, bought, like a gallon of milk and a dozen eggs, some bread, and a few other things. It was like these 2 little bags, $50 worth of groceries. And I was just flabbergasted. And that's because we weren't going to go out to the restaurants and eat every day and for all of our meals. Whew, man. Well, at any rate, they always say if you go to Hawaii, take half the clothes and twice the money. Make that 4 times the money, if you're going to do that. But whether our goal is to go to a son or daughter's wedding or to be generous with our church, it's still important to set that as a goal. Because if we don't set it as a goal, we're going to go off someplace or another. When we're generous, we have to remember we're not doing things for God. All we're doing is becoming a part of what God is doing in the world. That becomes our mission. And like Lindbergh, we have to consider the kind of excessive stuff that has to go if we're going to meet our goals. When we set our goal for generosity and work and live to meet that. If we're not careful, we will find ourselves living an ordinary life. One that we get to the end of and say, oh, well, that wasn't much, right? But none of us want to live just a blah life. We want to live a life that matters. We want to make a difference. And I think a lot of times when it comes to giving to our church or to other organizations that are doing great things, a lot of times we don't really understand the kind of impact that our giving makes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that next week. And in the meantime, if we want to live an extraordinary life, we need to continue to set those goals and to follow Christ's lead in being generous in every way. And if we do, we can defy gravity and go that distance from being just a consumer to being a generous supporter of God's work in the world. Now, I handed out those envelopes, and in those envelopes, you're going to see there's a schmoozy letter. You know what a schmoozy letter is, right? Everybody's gotten those. There's a copy of the church's budget for next week. Now, I don't want you to just say, oh, budget, I don't want to give to it, but I've got to. Because after all, supporting this church is a good thing. Where would the Scouts meet if everybody withdrew their support from this church? Where would the people get together to help out the kids who can't pay their school lunches here? This church does some great things. And a lot of times when we pay mission shares, it's like, oh, we're sending our money into this black hole. But no, that money does some really good things and some important works of ministry. So those are some things that are wonderful to continue. And there's also an estimate of giving card in that envelope. Now, the people who aren't here aren't going to miss out. They're going to get theirs in the mail. And that estimate of giving card, I want everybody to be clear about this. That is not a pledge. It's not a promise. If you don't fill one out and send it in, I'm not going to come knocking at your door. Mary's not going to come knocking at your door as chair of the finance committee saying, where is your pledge card? We're not going to sell your pledge card to a bank so that, and there are some churches that do that. People send their pledge cards, they turn them over to a bank, and then the collection agency gets the ones where people aren't up to date with their pledges. My gosh, giving needs to be joyful, and you need to enjoy generosity and not have your arm twisted to keep up with it. These estimate of giving cards are just that, they're guesses, and these things are for your benefit. So next week, we're going to collect those estimate of giving cards, and then about next September, we're going to get those back to you. So you can see whether you're keeping up with what you've prayed about, what you've estimated your giving is going to be. It's one of those reminders. Mary, you don't send out like quarterly giving statements at this church, do you? Okay, I didn't figure that you did. There are places we've been where that's done. Every quarter you see what you've given during that quarter as opposed to what you have said you were going to give through that quarter. And, it would never fail that you get to that quarter and it's, oh, wait, I missed a week here, or I missed a couple weeks there when we were on vacation. And so there would always be people sending in their money at that point. So it's good sometimes for us to be able to look at this and say, oh, am I keeping up with what I had planned to do? Because if you don't, you get to the end of the year, it's just like our monthly budget. You get to the end of the year and it's like, oh, crud, I don't have enough to cover what I had hoped to do. So those estimate of giving cards are tools for your benefit, not for the church. Like I said, it's not a promise. It's just a helpful thing for you. So I invite you to partner with God to provide for worship in this church, to help provide pastoral care to people, to help feed the hungry, to give clean water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to help with people's medical needs when they're ill. And until then, I would just encourage you to consider those secrets of generous people. Budget, live simply, set your goals. Use those things so that you will be able to come to the end of next year or the end of this year and say, yeah, I made it. I kept my goal, what I wanted to do. So thanks be to God. And don't give up on me yet. Just one more Sunday of hearing about defying gravity and about giving. Just one more Sunday. You can stand one more Sunday. Smile. Yeah, you can smile when I say that. And then after that, the following Sunday on December the 1st, look at your bulletin. We're going to be decorating the church for Christmas. There's going to be a potluck meal on December the 1st. So after we worship, we're going to eat, okay? And then we're going to decorate the church and enjoy one another's company and get ready for Advent and Christmas. So thanks be to God, and thank you for all that you do. God bless you.